Well, just when I thought I saw it all, Pastor Rich Tidwell breaks headlines with his announcements that he's taking his second wife and she is pregnant with his child. Rich Tidwell is the pastor of Ormond Church, a small non-denominational gathering in Canton, Missouri that was founded more than a decade ago. You'll see here a family photo of the whole family together. According to his website, he is a husband, father, YouTube apologist, polemicist, and passionate follower of the way. He married his wife, Brandy, more than 14 years, and they have 7 children ago, some adopted. Pastor Rich talks about his journey in all of this. He says this: in 2019, I discovered the surprising fact that God not only never prohibited polygamy throughout the entire Bible narrative, as he did with polyandry or homosexuality, but he divinely ordained it in several cases, including David in 2 Samuel 12, verses 7 through 8, Jacob in Genesis 30, Josiah in 2 Chronicles 24, among others. In contrast with homosexuality, which is outright prohibited by Leviticus 18 and Romans 1, God lawfully regulated the practices of plurality marriage. Now listen, I'm not going to give this bonehead much of attention, but this conversation has exploded online, particularly on Twitter, and I do think this needs to be addressed for the sake of younger believers who maybe haven't had this conversation before, but you should not take more than one wife in the era of the New Covenant Church. So here we are today. Let's get into this. Pastor Rich defended his position by citing King David. Oh yeah, isn't it great when we go back to Old Testament examples and try to bring them into the New Testament? We could create quite a bit of havoc doing that. But let's listen to the man himself and listen to some of his reasoning.
The Bible never demands monogamy. God never demands it. The Bible never prohibits polygyny. And to the shock of many, God compares David's lawful marriages, plural, with his unlawful union with Bathsheba in order to indicate that he had done the wrong thing. Moreover, in 2 Samuel 12, 7 and 8, God explicitly states, I gave your masters wives to you. Let's go and read. But unfortunately for the monogamy-only crowd, that's the only thing lawful in God's eyes, God gives David wives and then uses it as his arguing point for why what David did was so wrong. In other words, you already had lawful wives. Why would you take someone else's wife? If you took just a moment, you would study this out and see that not only does God not sin, but by him giving David wives, it shows you that that is not sin, because God doesn't sin. And you go, well, it's different now. The scriptures say, I, the Lord, do not change. Marriage law doesn't change. God's law regarding marriage doesn't change. Moreover, do we truly believe that if Abraham, Jacob, or David resurrected, which is a possibility according to Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 and 53, when many saints resurrected at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, that era, if those men resurrected because they can, would they not be permitted to hold office or preach in the church? Do we really believe that Paul, in one verse, is just disqualifying all the patriarchs who are prophets and elders from being prophets and elders anymore? They're now disqualified. Absolutely not. It's not what Paul is doing. That's ridiculous. How could we possibly? If Abraham resurrected, David resurrected, and came to preach at your church, you really believe he's not allowed because he has more than one wife? That's insane. Literally, it's insane. They wrote the scriptures we preach, and they wouldn't be allowed to preach those very scriptures that they wrote. That's obnoxious. Are you listening? Moses had more than one wife. Wrote 5 books of the Bible. We won't let him preach, though. That makes no sense. David wrote the Psalms. He even writes scriptures with commands and things to do. We wouldn't let him preach those things, though. He's not allowed. That doesn't make any sense. Romans 11:29 says, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. They're not in sin by having more than one wife, so their gifts and calling are irrevocable.
So you got to give it to this guy. He lacks the passion and enthusiasm for this, but I can say first and foremost, his probably church, his little church, will probably turn into a cult very shortly. But he had some points that are worth discussion and for the benefit and edification of the saints, but not following his logic on this one at all. If the patriarchs were resurrected for some reason, as he claimed, it would be at the second coming of Christ. And at that point, we would be ushered into a new era, a new heaven, a new earth. Nobody would be worrying about marriages or preaching or any of that. So I wasn't following his logic there. Now we're going to get into a second major argument that Pastor Rich had, where he claims God is a polemicist, and he gives his reasoning why he feels that.
31, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them. That's plural. God is indicating he was the husband of Israel and Judah, sisters whom he divorced. That's why he created the new covenant. And as a result of this, he says, I was a husband to them. Now, this might be considered the most heretical statement in tonight's video, but it's still scripturally sound and true. God is a polygamist. Yes, you see it right here. He was a husband to them. And since God is a polygamist, he certainly has no problem with his patriarchs and his prophets being polygamists as well.
Okay, so another video here. I don't even have to really try hard theologically to break this down. In those Bible passages that he's referencing, God is speaking to nations and not to individuals. So I don't think that he is applying the text correctly when he says that God applied a divorce to them. He's talking about Judah and Israel. These are nations. These are not individuals. So it just doesn't apply. Rich has a lot of bad logic here in this video and his other post online. I think he's using this for a big PR moment, and I think this will probably be as famous as the guy gets. After this dies down, nobody's going to know this guy or really care about him because it's hard to take him serious. At the same time, he probably does bring up some good points. God does not prohibit multiple wives in the Old Testament. So we're going to go to AI on this one and see what it has to say. So it says this, I use Grok on Twitter, but it says, yes, the Old Testament Hebrew Bible clearly allows and regulates polygamy, having multiple wives. It never commands it for everyone, but it treats it as normal, a permissible practice, especially for kings, wealthy men, and patriarchs. But here are a few examples. Abraham and Sarah ended up having Hagar. Jacob married Leah and Rachel. Gideon had many wives. David had at least 8 wives. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Samuel's father had 2 wives. Explicitly, the Old Testament laws that assume polygamy is legal. If a man takes a second wife, he must not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights to the first wife. In Deuteronomy 21, if a man has 2 wives, one loved and one unloved, he must give the firstborn son or even the unloved wife, a double portion inheritance. Deuteronomy 17:17, kings were warned not to multiply wives excessively. Solomon is later criticized for breaking this, not for polygamy itself, but for the huge number of foreign wives which led him into idolatry. So the key points here, polygamy is never praised as the ideal. The creation account in Genesis 2:24, the two shall become one flesh, is understood by most Jewish and Christian scholars as the original idea of monogamy. The Old Testament nowhere prohibits polygamy or calls it sin, but it regulates it to protect the wives of children and wives. Concubines, secondary wives with fewer rights, were also commonly and legally recognized. So yes, the Old Testament explicitly permits and regulates a man having multiple wives. Polygamy, polyandry, one woman with multiple husbands is never mentioned or allowed. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so I thought AI really got it pretty close on this one, but it should be noted that in the New Testament, we don't see anybody with multiple wives, not one single solution. So it's highly doubt that this would transfer over to the New Testament church. But let's just get into a couple of things and we'll close the video. some things other to consider here. First of all, King David and Solomon were very, very wealthy kings, and they could probably take care of multiple wives. A large majority of men would not be able to financially provide for multiple wives. Okay, so this is why I think in the Old Testament it was allowed for procreation purposes for rich men that were wealthy to help populate the earth, etc. I doubt Pastor Rich can possibly provide for all these kids. As you've seen, he has 7 kids, an 8th one coming on the way, 2 wives. He has a small little church, especially with all those children. I don't see how he could adequately provide for everybody. I got to be honest with you, okay? So basically, in his case, it might not be a good thing. He might not be able to take care of everybody correctly, all right? So the second thing is it moral? And I do not believe so. I do not believe that it would be moral to take up 2 wives in the New Testament. And in the United States, it would be against the law, okay? So you would be convicted of bigamy, which comes with a felony charge in 49 out of 50 of the states. So many people do not legally marry the second wife, and that's how Pastor Rich and many other people like Mormons and some people in Islam will take on a second wife. They just won't legally marry them on the books. So this is problematic for several reasons, because it would be showing partiality. So let's say you legally married one wife and didn't so for the second, you would be showing partiality. So it is against the law, which would be a great reason not to take up a second wife, because it does say in Romans how we should follow the laws of the land, etc. What about the emotional implications? Well, this would definitely be damaging to the women that were involved. Even if these women said it with their lips, they were okay with it. It's not a good thing. Obviously, we see this in the Bible, where basically Abraham's mistress, Hagar, ended up having to flee the house because Abraham's wife was so mean to her, etc. And it caused this emotional games, these emotional sparring between the women. It's just not a healthy environment. So if we go back to Genesis here, with basic theology, as it says in Genesis 2, the 2 shall become 1. And this would be the strongest argument not to take up a second wife in the New Testament time period, in the New Covenant time period. On top of this, what happens if the wives decide that they want another husband? Okay, so this could really set off some bad cycles and could be never ending. So why open up the Pandora's box to begin with? And lastly, the thing that I will say is that this would not be a good look to unbelievers. This is not a good testimony. So I would say no to polygamy all across the board on theological, legal, emotional, and spiritual grounds. It should be noted that in the Old Testament, God did not prohibit multiple wives for whatever reason. But this seemed to be limited to kings and wealthy people and rulers. This might be a good question to ask God one day when we get to heaven, why he did not rebuke this, why he did not prohibit this. But in the New Testament church, in the New Covenant church, I believe the standards have been raised for believers, and marriage should be between one man and one woman. Jesus goes back to Genesis when talking about marriage, and he said, but you see that Moses said this, but I said this. So Jesus seems to be going back to Genesis, calling us to a higher standard, a new standard, where a marriage is between one man and one woman, and the 2 shall become one. And this is a sacred thing that should not be broken with another wife. Thank you for watching today. Be blessed.